I'm in studio. This time about philosophy, but also psychiatry about charity and life. For sure, my life is partly some sort of charity, but also philosophy together with Aristotle function to understand different forms of discussion, but also to understand different claims is very important if you are building different forms in life. To understand C++ functions, but also different forms of psychology, together with programs, it's not easy to understand your partner. Also, in life, it's very difficult to build a perfect forms or better level of speech, especially when it comes to astronomy or medicine. To understand physics together with your partners, it's not easy, especially if you are modeling. But also, me include the license for banking. My license for banking, it's not shared. But of course, charity for some natural models. To understand different things, but also life, it is not easy. And a lot of people think that family is something personal, but for me, family it's all people in this world. And for all people in this world, me actually wish a beautiful life. Not only beautiful mouth, throat, legs, and hands, but also beautiful body and beautiful philosophy. If you have very, very difficult theory about life, it is very hard to live beauty in life. And of course, it's very difficult to understand modern church philosophies or what they think history should be. To understand the history of gold, it's not easy. But if you think about me, you should actually look for technical approach of things or also technical philosophy, how to describe different discipline or working forms in this life. To understand different forms in this life, you might also think about different forms of code. When it comes to me, any form of word breach is 100% prohibited. The prohibited are also links. And we have millions of self policy and self limits. What thing me could not do with my photos or look. And also to understand different forms of philosophy, it's not easy. To understand naturalism in America, also for me, it's not easy. And also to understand and know all law in America, it's not easy. Because to understand respect to law in America, you can actually understand the respect to law in every country. Because some things, you know what, are completely the same. Likewise, companies, brands, different forms of vegetables, and many more things. It is very important to understand different forms of therapy also for all companies that are mentioning me wrongly. To understand different forms of construction in life, but also social problems is very important. Once you understand social problems, you can actually support better climatic change. To understand the attitude in life is sometimes you must surrender with medicine to build a better medicine. There might be millions of different materials to check your bones or to check the materials anywhere in your body. Of course, natural is the best, but some people sometimes in this life and this planet also need other materials to replace the originals. Of course, me is not perfect, and once you're going to observe me, you'll find some mistake. But guess what? Not even the richest people in this world are perfect, and that's why crises appear in this world. From the philosophy, me would be from the moon or other fantasy planet Of course, in that forum, me could also think much more about universe. If universe is me, then me could speak for the world. But from the philosophy point, if me would not be a person, but some sort of universal Spain American European, but also a little bit of London form of design together with law. Now you understand how difficult the philosophy could be, where you exist or where do you live, or what the hell would be the origin. To understand Latin America, it's actually very difficult, but also different forms of analysis the different science sector make sometimes make no sense about different cure that they are making or they are analyzing any form of quality about me or my millions of books around the world. To understand different forms of philosophy together with Australian banks, it's also not easy because me is also providing some chips for the world. The circuits are not easy, especially in more professional circles. But to understand this history of me in America, but also in Europe, it's also not easy. Of course, those are also connected to some point, but not too much when it comes to different forms of simple philosophy or simple laws that humans actually have. Of course, the laws are extremely toxic sometimes, but also to understand the common speech together with Germans or with Latin Americans. And me sometimes also decide for Germany languages and not always for American English. Sometimes also the English of London, which is much, much different than American, very strange ethics English. The London English actually have some differences. To understand those differences, sometimes also important in traditions, but also in ethics. Of course, different forms of developments sometimes become distractions also in America. And that's why sometimes it's better to understand simple, ethical, elegant, and logical London forms. And of course, without sound, because sound in London make no logic indeed. Concepts in London are very difficult, especially when it comes to whole United Kingdom. Of course, me united with other would mean a disaster. And that's why the discussions with me about United Kingdom or Great Britain are strictly prohibited to understand different forms of united people which usually do not agree with each other. It's very important to build different forms of analysis if you are going to live in London more than 5 years. But also, for people from America, we would recommend some authors like Gian Tommy, but also some others if you are thinking about prosperity in London, but also about prosperity in United Kingdom. But for sure, do not unite with any other people out if you do not like their details or life. Of course, me should not think that me is better than others, but sometimes it's better to make your own expression. Authors usually are strict adults, but they can also change their mind and become like little kids. And they understand very old people in London, but also very, very young. That's the difference about the others' figure or picture of life. But other older people in London or smaller could not do that. To have some imagination in life, it builds a better philosophy. And sometimes it's very important to understand different range of imagination also for medicine. The usual doctor, for example, in London or United Kingdom, could not really imagine that there are 200 millions materials to replace snails or bone or anything like bone. Sometimes it's very important to understand that Probably all those materials already exist, but Europeans, Americans, but also Londoners are not prepared to build different designs in their medicine theory to build a better and better medicine. Usually people only think about how to make a lot of fortune with medicine, which is not the most important tradition in my life. Some transformations sometimes are also important. To build political London, that's some sort of theory. And of course, for some people, very important, but not for me. Of course, different forms of schools in London are also slightly political because there is a lot of science inside, but also to understand different forms of analytics in all over the America, but also all over the Europe. And sometimes it's very, very difficult to understand how school will be different than science because science itself is very, very simple. Sometimes when people finish schools, you should actually exist, do that even matters in life. Because sometimes it's better to become scientist. To understand different forms of philosophy in London is not easy, but also different forms of constructions. And of course, when you come to me, do not connect me with any constructions when you come to London. To understand different forms of meanings in my books, also about existential philosophies all around America and all around United Kingdom, but also a little bit about Europe. It's very difficult to understand simple book of me or to build characters with some consciousness pictured in a book form. Of course, there are millions of misinterpretations about me in modern world, but of course me is 18th century classic. Sometimes it's very important and critical to build a good theory. Without good theory and sociology forum in London, but also in United Kingdom, it's very difficult to understand. Also, the feminist theory, the woman rights and the rights of men. Me even think that in 90% of case, men's rights are violated in United Kingdom. But of course would not argue with the Queen which one have right. For me, it's more important to build social peace, but of course, that would be the ideology or psychology together with book and medicine, which is actually extremely, extremely dangerous if you do not understand that philosophy can start feminist theories, psychology, and other forms to understand different forms of well being in life. But also in London, it's not easy. In life, it's not easy to understand behaviors, but also ethics in life or how to build a better neuroscience clinics. In natural design of London or United Kingdom, of course, also feel is important. Sometimes it's very important to build better science, also if you are living in America or Europe. Sometimes it's also very good to understand different forms of clinical, but also to understand different forms of psychotherapy in life. To understand different forms of science is very important, but also to build different forms of organizations, but also to understand psychology in life. There are millions of social issues in humans' lives in London, but it's very, very, very important to understand good psychology in London, but also in United Kingdom. To understand American psychology, it's not easy, but also the society and their laws, what's legal and what's not. And of course, the authors have millions of laws made by themselves. Some are even real in laws in America. To understand laws and build laws, it's not easy because you should be a lawyer and author, but some people are only authors, which of course it's not perfect. Of course, some authors are pretty good lawyers, and some are extremely toxic when it comes to different forms of schools. to understand different forms in life, but also to understand different forms of members in America, but also psychology. It's very important. It is very important to understand different forms in life, but also in populations. To understand biology in America, it's not easy, but also not too easy to understand biology in United Kingdom. There is millions of biological psychology, but also to understand different forms of mechanisms and underlying behaviors in human life. People like to compare to each other, but also to compare their psychology with each other, but you should not compare with author because in that case you'll have mental illness. To understand humans, it's not always easy, but also it's not always easy to understand different forms of different brain functions, but also how humans actually want better story. And sometimes in life it's better that some product do not have any story. Of course, if we would originate from 20 million years ago, that would not be a figure, but more like a universe. To understand different forms of neuroscientists and neuropsychologists in life, it's not easy. But it's also very, very difficult to understand yoga. Pathology and different forms of treatment, it's also not easy in life. And there are a lot of neurology forums together with humans disorders in social life. Of course, even doctors can have neurology disorders, but also some psychologists have millions of disorders because they have very, very difficult concepts. They only think about science, but not what is actually natural. The problem of scientists is very, very difficult. And of course, in my book, described as a rubber psychologist, no rub at all, only a strange design for the author. Sometimes it's also very good to understand cognitive effects when you show some design or present very, very strange product. There are different forms of the treatments together with forensic, but also clinical settings together with medicine, Taoism hospitals, but also different forms of rehabilitations. To understand life in life, it's not easy, but also me include some simple forms of psychology. To understand life, but also the influence of some book in entire world is very, very difficult to understand different forms of dreams that people have about authors. It's also important so you do not lose sense about yourself. Some people are actually focusing on impression in social life, and of course those impressions are some sort of jail. To understand different forms in life, but also dualism and how people want to compare to each other, it's very strange because leaders usually want to think about things. In Taoism, actually, they do not think so much, but they actually feel. So that's much different if you feel the world or you only think about it from technological point. The technology is actually very complex, but sometimes it's also very important to understand your own disorders. The disorders in life are very important because with disorders we also see disorders in ourselves, but also how much disorders we did get from society. The society is extremely complex, and the animals are also extremely complex. And if you study animals a little bit or their designs, you'll see how much famous people are actually very, very difficult, and animals are also very difficult. Sometimes you should not judge famous people, sometimes you should not judge animals, but you should also not judge different forms of strange humans. Sometimes it's very, very important to build simple forms in life, but also to understand different forms of psychiatrists. So you are going to build a better theory about life. With better theory about life, you build a better life.